Welcome. I'm Roland Green, Director of the Stanford Humanities Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first in a new series of lectures called All This Rising, the Humanities in the Next 10 Years. The goal of the series is to deliver attention to ideas and methods that will mark new paths for the humanities in the next decade. The name of the series comes from a poem by Fred Moten in his book, All That Beauty. All this heroic rising above not hearing, and this rising in absolute north against the grain. When I became director of the Stanford Humanities Center last year, on the eve of our 40th anniversary celebration, it seemed to me that it was the moment to reinforce the center's purpose, to expand our programs, and to uphold our distinctive office on campus of bringing the most exciting ideas in the broader humanities to Stanford, and now online to the rest of the world. Among other things, we have launched several series of new events, some exploring research by Stanford faculty, some featuring figures whose research lends itself to social change, and now with All This Rising, a series for emerging paradigms in the humanities. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to mention that the presentation is being recorded and will be available on our website in the coming days. If you'd like to submit a question to the speaker, please use the Q&A box in Zoom, and we will do our best to get to it following the lecture. Dan-el Padilla Peralta is Associate Professor of Classics at Princeton University. A native Dominican and a New Yorker, Professor Pavilla was educated at Princeton, Oxford, Stanford, where as a PhD student, he held the prestigious Interdisciplinary Graduate Fellowship, and Columbia, where he spent 2 postdoctoral years in the Society of Fellows. A scholar of ancient Roman ideologies, rituals, and institutions, Professor Padilla is the author of 2 books, Divine Institutions, Religions and Communities in the Middle Republic, which just appeared from Princeton University Press, and a memoir, Undocumented, A Dominican Boy's Odyssey from a Homeless Shelter to the Ivy League, published by Penguin in 2015. He is the co-editor of Rome, Empire of Plunder, The Dynamics of Cultural Appropriation, published by Cambridge University Press in 2017. Professor Padilla's current projects include a study of 338 BCE and the origins of Roman imperialism, a co-edited volume on the long 4th century BCE, and a co-authored book-length essay on race and ethnicity in the disciplinary identity of classics. He is one of the leading public scholars of his generation, serving on the editorial board of the public-facing classics journal Eidolon and writing for The Guardian, The New York Times, and other outlets. As I mentioned, Dan-el Padilla Peralta holds a PhD in classics from Stanford, and that fact makes it a special honor to have him join us for the first lecture in the series titled Darkness Visible, the Haunted House of Classics. Dan-el, welcome back to Stanford.
It's so great to be back, and I'm so delighted to be virtually back on the West Coast. I want to start by thanking you, Roland, and thanking the entire Stanford Humanities Center community for the invitation to kick off this lecture series. The series is an expression of faith in the meaningfulness and durability of the humanities, and my talk today will seek to model a critical humanities that can operate within multiple temporalities at once: the past, present, and future of racial hegemony and systemic racial violence, the past, present, and future of university neoliberalization and precarity, the past, present, and future of disciplinary introspection. But these are jittery times, and I am sure I am not alone among the webinar participants in feeling the knot in my stomach tighten as tomorrow's reckoning for American democracy draws ever closer. 4 years ago today, I was on the West Coast preparing to fly back east after a week of lecturing and waving off my spouse's concerns that we were all on the verge of an electoral surprise. I hope that my virtual return to the West Coast is not teeing up another replay of November 2016. But to allow myself some indulgence in the warmth of the return and the virtual company of friends, I appreciate this opportunity to come back to the Stanford community. Appropriately enough, as we come out of the Halloween weekend, I propose to talk about the haunting of the discipline of classics, and specifically its racial haunting. There is no question that after decades of sidelining or euphemistic rebranding, processes of race and racialization in ancient Western Eurasia are now more regular topics of conversation in ancient and medieval studies. At the same time, and especially in recent months, the Euro-American Academy has been awash in the rhetoric of diversity and inclusion. But I am skeptical both about the sincerity and about the staying power of the flurry of initiatives announced by institutions on both sides of the Atlantic, for the very simple reason that, as Roderick Ferguson observed in 2012, quote, "State, capital, and academy see minority insurgence as a site of calculation and strategy. Minority difference in culture as positivities that could be part of their own series of aims and objectives," end quote. Without a wide-ranging and encompassing critique of the Academy's active investments in settler-colonialist and racist modes of predation, there is little chance that these initiatives will yield anything other than self-congratulatory odes or cresting nostalgia, the two types of affects in which apologetic humanists are unquestionably steeped. Such a critique will need to confront directly the white identitarian epistemics of specific academic disciplines, beginning with those whose emergence is coeval with the rise of the modern university itself. And this brings me to classics. Excitement about the bevy of publications and initiatives in classics and classics adjacent fields should be tempered by awareness of the task that remains, not only to locate, assess, and contend with the racist or proto-racist social architectures of Greco-Roman antiquity, or in a classical reception vein to monitor appropriations and mobilizations of ancient Greece and Rome in the service of 20th and 21st century racist nationalisms, but to evaluate critically the implicatedness of the species of disciplinarity that defines the field of classics in the design, conception, and promulgation of specific racial formations. My argument for this talk will be that as a result of its long and storied efforts to avoid frank talk about race, the field of classics has come to a point where its intellectual tools are inadequate to the project of confronting race. Such a claim has several consequences, most of which I will be unable to examine in depth in this talk, but which I will be happy to discuss in the Q&A. For one, if I am correct to suppose that classics is exceptionally well practiced in the evasion or ghosting of race, it will follow that 21st centuries to rectify this will at best amount to half measures unless attention is paid to the characteristic features of the field's constitution and orientation, which for shorthand purposes I will refer as its disciplinarity. Here are the features of this disciplinarity that I will comment on today, braiding together quantitative exposition with qualitative redescription. Number one, enclosure. For this feature, my major debt is to Caroline Bilthoff's remarks in Against Scholarly Enclosures, which appeared in the inaugural issue of Capitalism, a journal of history and economics. Quote, "The call for genuine interdisciplinary dialogue is both promising and difficult because it casts light on the bed where capitalism and the university system have long shared an ideological liaison. The dividends of our varied specializations are usually reinvested in the very silos we periodically critique, the departments that generate both our professional degrees and our livelihoods," end quote. The habit of enclosure and the stocking and restocking of disciplinary silos comes into sharp focus when one looks at the citational practices of classicists. Among the most characteristic aspects of this citational practice is the pairing of a tendency to raid very selectively other disciplines for conceptual tools with a highly aggressive and stringently enforced ethics of inward-facing citation. It would be appropriate to speak here not only of a lack of hermeneutic generosity, but of a sustained inability to approach other fields as anything other than land from which resources can be extracted, while policing classics itself as an enclosure. Those webinar attendees who participated in or heard about the recent AOS Reads for Black Lives will recall Margot Hendrix's description of pre-modern race studies as, quote, "ignoring the pre-existing inhabitants of the land," end quote, in her 2019 lecture for the Race Before Race initiative. I'm interested in generalizing this comment about PRS's settler colonialist propensities to the field of classics as a whole. I would contend that enclosure and its kin extractivism are apparent on two levels. The first, to which I have already gestured, is the metaphor-aided conceptualization of fields on the outside as terrain to exploit and drain. In this respect, classics isn't much different from other Euro-American humanistic disciplines, although it may very well lay claim to a longer pedigree for this practice than most. The second, and the one more tangibly inscribed in the citational habits of classicists, is the inchoate state of anything resembling an inclusive citational ethics. I'll spend time with each of these claims in a moment. 2, playing in the dark. My name for this feature parrots the title of Toni Morrison's 1992 book, and my premise here likewise takes its cue from it. That, much like the scene in American literary studies that Morrison surgically dispatches, so too is the scene of classics marked by the centering and normativizing of white man viewpoints that deny race any legibility. In fact, classics is so successful at mystifying its own presumptive non-racialization that its disciplinary histories take no cognizance of race and racism at all. Surely the clearest sign of what Karen and Barbara Fields have provocatively labeled racecraft. 3, non-presentism. The disciplinarity of classics is staked to a linear account of time in which the present is severed from the distant past. Even though classicists working in numerous subfields have taken an axe to this conceit, either by stressing the untimeliness of classical antiquity, a topic brought to the fore in reception studies, or by plotting big history or comparative history enterprises that stress consequential continuity and discontinuity, the discipline as a whole remains compromised by the insistence that, well, it was all so very long ago. In a challenge to this, I will offer several anecdotal demonstrations of what it might mean to inhabit a disciplinarity that does not contend, that does more faithfully contend with the impingements of the racial present on the process of knowledge formation. And I'll start with enclosure. The premier publication organs of classics have historically done an abysmal job of welcoming and supporting the work of non-white classicists, and especially Black classicists. Last year, Roberta Stewart and Dominic Machado demonstrated in a study of the first 150 years of the journal TAPA that, quote, even as women and immigrants entered into the pages of TAPA and the American academic discourse of classics, end quote, in the decades after World War II, quote, there are no publications authored by Black scholars in this period, end quote. And lest you be thinking, as some of my more charming correspondents in the past 2 years have insisted over email, that this is because there were so few Black classicists, it should be noted that our evidence for the intensity of African-American engagements with classics is now on an excellent footing, thanks to the work of Shelley Haley, Michelle Valerie Ronick, and others, and that it grows richer and more variegated by the year. I will have more to say about how these disciplinary ancestors have been ghosted in mainstream accounts of the discipline in a moment. The exclusionary practices of journals and other gatekeeping disciplinary mechanisms are coming in for closer scrutiny in other fields too, of course. Among my favorite recent peregrinations in the domain of meta-disciplinary study is a sophisticated appraisal of diversity or its lack at US museums, which you see featured on this slide. By scraping the public online catalogs of 18 museums, the authors of this study that came out last year found that 85% of artists in museum collections are white and 87% of them are men. For now, though, I'll move in a slightly different direction. As flesh on the bones from my comments earlier on citational ethics, let me begin by rolling out some data that is culled from the start of year 2015 and 2020 issues for 3 major US-based classics journals. What I've done for each journal is select 2 issues each, 5 years apart, and gone through and tabulated the number of items in the bibliography for every single article, excluding reviews. Next, I counted the number of items in these bibliographies that were classics specific, either because they were also published in a classics journal or classics monograph, because they were classics centered in content, because they're indexed in l'année philologique and other classics research tools. Finally, I calculated the percentage of bibliographical items that were classic specific for each article and for the journal issue as a whole. And I show here the journal averages. These averages for what I will call inward facing citation dance between 80% and below 90%. As I was generating the data, I noticed that the average figure for each journal issue tends to be brought down by 1 and at the most 2 articles per issue that are more liberally interdisciplinary in their citational practices, such as, to name only the most conspicuous example, a 75-page article on Homeric poetry and orality that included 117 non-classics bibliographic items in its 280-item bibliography. So I adjusted the averages by dropping the highest and lowest scoring bibliographies from my calculation. With this adjustment, the averages all cluster around 90%, and in two cases, Journal B in 2020 and Journal A in 2015, approach 100%. As with any quantitative exercise of this sort, some caveats are in order. First, we are dealing with a small sample size, 34 articles total, spread out across 6 journal issues. These 34 articles do list over 3,100 items in their bibliographies, though, so seen from a different angle, the figures here do carry some weight. That having been said, there is no pretense to longitudinal depth here, and the better approach to harvesting and curating this data would be to track these figures over time, as I hope to do in the near future. Turning to other quibbles, my distinction between classics and non-classics in deriving these bibliographic statistics may have been too blunt, though I did try my hardest to be generous. And an evangelist for the field's inherent interdisciplinarity might object that what we should really be doing is tracking this data according to the subfield in which each article locates itself. Without unmasking the journals, what I'll say for now is that they specialize in publishing articles that fall into the traditional bins of classics, but that by and large, they don't make space for articles that are heavy on material culture and archaeology, for example, or classical reception, two fields that are much more outward-facing in their bibliographic configurations. The data can be made to tell a story of a field that asserts its habits of enclosure by privileging the publication of articles that are meticulously doxographic and inward-facing in nature. It remains to compare these data to studies of journals in other disciplines. A flip through the pages of recent AHR and PMLA issues left me with the strong impression that classicist rates of inward-facing citation are unusually high, but this impression will need more decisive corroboration. Besides the data on this slide, there are some other notes that we could play in a more minor key. Those articles whose bibliographies do show some awareness of the world beyond classics are, unsurprisingly, the product of subfields whose relationship to the mainstream of the discipline is complicated or problematic, historically and in the contemporary moment. I'm thinking of subfields such as comparative linguistics, religion, especially religion with an anthropological focus, or social scientific history. By contrast, articles centered in the spheres of ancient philosophy, literary criticism, or political history cluster in the upper ranges of the inward-facing citation metric. When articles do turn to other disciplines, the protocol is unabashedly extractivist. Concepts or tools are lifted from these other fields, but with barely a thought aired as to what classicists may offer practitioners in those fields. It's almost always a smash and grab operation. Finally, it is instructive to observe which fields external to classics are tapped for their resources and which are not. Excluding for now the aforementioned Homeric poetry article and a similarly premised venture into another branch of Greek archaic poetry, I'll note that whenever theory exogenous to classics enters the room, it is mostly French, Badiou, Bourdieu, Derrida, Foucault, with a nod to Russian and American formalist approaches on occasion, Jakobson. Intriguingly, some fields that might have much to offer classicists do not appear on the collective map of the discipline's enclosure, either as sites for ancestral identification or as sites for extraction. Of the 34 articles, only 2 make any productive or extensive use of literature from ethnic studies or critical race studies. The existence of these patterns should, at a minimum, encourage classicists to follow the lead of art historians such as Elena Fitzpatrick Sifford and Ananda Cohen-Aponte, whose call to action includes a summons, quote, to democratize our citational practices. Citation is political, and to reject those, quote, narrow discipline-specific citational footprints, end quote, that entrench prevailing forms of racial and linguistic hegemony. Sifford and Cohen-Aponte's criticisms of art historians who, in their words, fail to acknowledge popular and alternative forms of scholarship based in orality, intergenerational knowledge, and social networking and social media, end quote, holds equally true for classicists. In the issues that I surveyed, only a few articles made any reference to online resources, and the one article to commit substantial citational energy in the direction of orality and other forms of non-textualized knowledge was, you guessed it, an article on Homer. Collecting and curating data on citational footprints is, I believe, a more effective tool for diagnosing the field's exclusionary tendencies and epistemic limitations than simply surveying classicists. In last year's TAPA sesquicentennial anniversary issue, Eric Adler and Calvert Jones sought to extract from a survey of 500 randomly chosen members of the Society for Classical Studies answers to the question, what do classicists really think? But I would argue that the proof is actually in the pudding and that classicists need to be evaluated not on the basis of their thoughts, but their deeds. Among the most political deeds of professional classicists is the decision of whom to cite. As several responses to Adler and Jones's survey made explicit, it is in the fundamentally conservative nature of the field's scholarship that its navel-gazing properties are most transparently exposed. And I would argue that it is in the work of citation above all else that the lineaments of what Ryuko Kubota in a critique of applied linguistics called epistemological racism shine forth most brightly. In any case, one might also choose to work backwards from the deed of citation to a set of propositions concerning the emotional and psychological architectures of the discipline. In partial illustration of the affective registers that give coherence to the discipline's brand of extractivist playing in the dark, I'd like next to think with what Avery Gordon has described as the quote, the story about what happens when we admit the ghost, that special instance of the merging of the visible and invisible, the dead and the living, the past and the present, into the making of worldly relations and into the making of our accounts of the world, end quote. Classicists not infrequently take pride in bringing blood to the ghosts, and to some degree it may very well be said of classics as the discipline that it does conform to Derrida's definition of a hauntology as the quote, non-contemporaneity with itself of the living present, end quote. But the ritual offering of blood to the ghosts is pre and overdetermined by racial constructs that foreground some spectral presences and shut out others. In other words, the field's capacity to admit ghosts into its midst is regulated, like any other feature of its production and circulation of knowledge, by the racial investments of the living. To make this claim more intelligible, I'd like first to take a detour and consider how the discipline of Euro-American classics has fashioned its dominant identities by reference specifically to the monumentally long A History of Classical Scholarship, published in 3 volumes between 1903 and 1909, as the culmination of the British classicist Sir John Edwin Sand's indefatigable labors. Before flagging what this work does not contain, and what it in fact diligently endeavors to scrub out of visibility and existence, a few words on the charms and complex pleasures of its treatment of the history of classical scholarship. By European country and by century or 2-century intervals, the latter 2 volumes of HCS survey the pursuit of classical scholarship from 1300 CE to the present. Its literary mode is primarily biographical, with the mostly cut and dry business of educational institutions attended and Greco-Roman authors studied and researched, spiced up from time to time with a suggestive anecdote. But these anecdotes aren't included for the sole purpose of juicing up Sand's genealogies. They're also included to mold readerly affects and orient dispositions towards the figures who feature in the narrative and the exemplary scholarly virtues or vices that are distributed across his pantheon of literate eminences. In the interest of brevity, I will confine myself to 2 anecdotes that are both sampled from the 2nd volume. While surveying the major actors from Petrarch to the full bloom of the Italian Renaissance, Sands quotes at length Benvenuto's arresting description of Boccaccio's visit to Monte Cassino, which was fueled by a desire to see the ancient manuscripts that were held there. Being eager to see the library, which he had heard was very noble, he humbly besought one of the monks to do him the favor of opening it. Pointing to a lofty staircase, the monk answered stiffly, "Go up, it is already open." Boccaccio stepped up the staircase with delight, only to find the treasure house of learning destitute of door or any kind of fastening, while the grass was growing on the windowsills and the dust reposing on the books and bookshelves. Turning over the manuscripts, he found many rare and ancient works with whole sheets torn out or with the margins ruthlessly clipped. As he left the room, he burst into tears, and on asking a monk whom he met in the cloister to explain the neglect, was told that some of the inmates of the monastery, wishing to gain a few soldi, had torn out whole handfuls of leaves and made them into psalters, which they sold to boys, and had cut off strips of parchment, which they turned into amulets to tell to women. Despair at the sight of the disrepair of the library and the mangled bodies of these manuscripts, the presumption that this mangling is the consequence of neglect, the revelation that some of the monastery's residents had recycled manuscript leaves in order to make some coin, Boccaccio's feelings are centered for the purpose of eliciting a specific set of emotions from the reader. This is an exemplary narrative, not only because it communicates the idealized determination of the zealous student of the ancient world, but because it communicates how one should feel when that determination confronts the realities of a present that is marked by poverty, inattention, and the necessity of prioritizing the work of living over the preservation of what is no longer alive. One should grieve by this account and then remonstrate, because what should matter most to the students of classics is not the sight of human beings in destitution or abjection, but the conditions of the text. If there is suffering to care deeply and truly about, it is the suffering of the text and the miserable negligence of those human beings whose material needs prevent the scholar from accessing the text in its undisturbed glory. On this reading, the saga of Boccaccio's visit to Monte Cassino titrates into the vessel of anecdote what is ultimately the anti-humanity of the classical, the preference of text over humans. A wrinkle on this theme is explored a few pages later in Sands with the help of another choice vignette. Here, Sands is recounting the journeys of Poggio Bracciolini, Cencio Justici, and Bartolomeo da Montepulciano in 1416 as they set out in search of manuscripts. So eager was the quest that even the wretched condition of the roads did not prevent them from sallying forth from Constance and climbing the steep slopes that led to St. Gallen, some 20 miles distant. In that ancient home of learning, they found the abbot and the monks absolutely uninterested in literature, and many a precious manuscript lying amid the dust and damp and darkness of one of the towers of the abbey church. A noisome prison, says Poggio, to which even criminals condemned to death would never have been consigned. Again, the determination of the classical scholar is lionized and extolled. Conditions on the road be damned. The unnamed human stewards of the text are presumed to be absolutely uninterested in literature, allowing manuscripts to wallow in the subjection of mere carceral damp and dark. The wrinkle of interest to me is the ventriloquizing of the text that's performed by Cencio, who he imagines pleading in unison before lovers of the Latin language for their emancipation from prison. And second, the proposition that text can suffer a fate that not even incarcerated humans can. The text can experience an objection that is somehow deeper, and yet by virtue of their standing in Latin text, as Latin text, undeserved, and thus most stirringly unjust. To recap, Sands HCL offers, mobilizes, and bundles the propositions that the classical text should command superhuman effort to be accessed because it is greater than any human or human needs. That the plight of text not yet rescued or delivered from the oblivion of monastic enclosure deserves more sympathy than the carceral subjugation and exploitation of living, breathing human beings. And that the truly devoted, because tireless in their devotion, classical scholars have a better understanding of how to take care of these texts than their presumptive or current stewards. The implications of this argument through example are hardly limited to an analysis of Sands' compositional style. They gesture to a fundamental ideological substructure immanent in the history of classical scholarship, and to the history of classical scholarship as a genre of disciplinary practice whose priorities are defined and enforced by people such as Sands. This ideological substructure comes into focus if we consider the history of classical scholarship's omissions. The least remarkable aspect of Sands' work is that it does not feature a single non-European scholar. That's probably not going to come as a shock. Arguably more remarkable is that the work so resolutely trains its sights on Europe that it does not and cannot bring to acknowledge itself to acknowledge the extent to which shifts in classical scholarship, in authors read, avenues of research opened up, networks cultivated, were dictated by and ultimately answerable to the entwined priorities of European settler colonialism and the transatlantic slave trades. Why do Roman imperial history and Greek and Roman ethnography surge to the forefront of classical scholarship in the 16th, 17th, and early 18th centuries? Why is there such an escalation of interest not only in Roman law, but in maritime and commercial law, and in the 17th and 18th centuries, the Roman law of slavery? Why in the 18th century do British historians of ancient Greece take such an avid interest in the relationship of Greek colonies with their metropoles? You will search in vain for answers to these questions in Sands. The first and only mention of the transatlantic slave trade in the history of classical scholarship comes in a discussion of the classical predilections of the great parliamentary orators of the 18th century, which is capped by a brief excursus on William Pitt the Younger. During the peroration of his great speech on the abolition of the slave trade, even his opponents listened to him as one inspired. The debate had lasted through the night, and the rays of the rising sun were streaming into the House when the orator closed a splendid period on the coming dawn of a brighter day for the natives of Africa with the fine quotation from Virgil, and when on us the rising sun first breathes his panting steeds, there glowing vesper is kindling his evening rays. Where the classical does intersect with the machinery of empire, it is only as representation of another species of exemplarity. Classical learning as rhetorical embellishment of the kind that spruces up a stem-winding oration. Yet this classical learning is also the property and preserve of the architects of empire, to be tapped as a resource for prognosticating about the starry future that awaits the benighted, because be blackened. Invocation of the classical elicits feeling for the subjected on the part of those who hold power over their future, but at no point is the production of knowledge under the form of the classical understood to hold some responsibility for or to be accountable to the transatlantic slave trades whose abolition Pitt the Younger envisioned. It should also be noted, apropos of Sand's triumphant citation of Pitt the Younger, that the 1792 speech doesn't actually result at the time in the passage of the motion to abolish the slave trade. In any event, and more relevant to my purposes, few and far between are the references in Sand's, or for that matter, any Anglophone history of classical scholarship, to the interaction of classics with those colonial and racist imperial orders whose absence would have deprived classical scholarship not only of capital and material, but of its raison d'etre. The amplification of the classical scholar, first as virtuous chaser of lost texts, and then as proud critic and consumer and occasional ventriloquizer of their contents, shuts the door on any attempt, however minimalist or fleeting, to identify the many points of intersection between the practice of classical scholarship and the derivation of material and psychic profits from a white supremacist world system. That Sands was unable to move in the direction of such an attempt is not exactly jaw-dropping news. That late 20th and early 21st century classicists remain incapable of making a move in this direction should be. Why is such a move so hard to execute? To begin, there is the supposition that classics exist at a remove from racial politics, that its constitutive whiteness is itself not orientated towards racial politics. The neo-reflexive nature of this special pleading comes out in, for example, the British classicist Hugh Lloyd-Jones' complaint in one of his essays that a bookstore had had the temerity to line up its Latin, Greek, and ancient history shelves right next to Native American and Black studies, as if the latter somehow polluted the former. The habit afflicts even the less distinguished avatars of unblinking white identitarian classics, such as the enthusiast for Roman grand strategy, who recently wrote to the TLS to grumble that, quote, just because there is much talk of race in the US during these months, it does not mean that a book about turnips or about the classics should address it, end quote. But the habit is hardly confined to these enclosures. To look for the constitutive agency of race in the discipline's meditations on its own history is to be confronted almost immediately by silence. That these histories are often arranged as concatenated biographies a la Sands is part of the problem. With their devoted focus on the individual classicist institutional pedigrees and the res gestae, these histories, for the most part, don't discern or so much as acknowledge the benefits that many of their shining lights derive directly and indirectly from the interlaced forces of white supremacy and Euro-American settler-colonialism. Politics, religion, ideas shape the individual, according to the essays prefacing one of these collections, but apparently not race. Not one biographical entry in the Biographical Dictionary of North American Classicists even so much as mentions the force of racism in the antebellum and postbellum United States. The Dictionary of British Classicists performs the same work of silencing for the United Kingdom. The logical inference is that every single person profiled in these dictionaries gleans the rewards of white supremacy, or that the final status of both projects is a direct reflection of the racial myopias of their respective editors and contributors. Of course, it could also be both. The American Dictionary's introductory essay, with its punt on any direct responsibility for building a more racially inclusive classics, in the process also models how not to practice a racially inclusive intellectual history of the discipline. And I quote, "It is the task of the next generation to attract Blacks and Asians into classics," end quote, as if people of color had not been contributing to the discipline for generations. This dictionary's omission of the African-American classicist William Sanders Scarborough is about as striking as its deliberate cloaking of Princeton alum Basil Lanu Gildersleeve's Racism, which is finessed away through discrete reference to his defense of the Southern cause. Synthetic treatments of the discipline's past and present prospects that ditch biography in favor of topic or theme-based historical reconstruction have not fared much better. Neither the legacies of Greece or Rome nor the future of the classical are understood to intersect in any meaningful way with globe-spanning systems of race. Not only the future, but the past of the past has been subjected to searching scrutiny in 21st century histories of the discipline. Yet even here, the romance of ancient Greece and Rome's production of pastness and future perfectness tiptoes around race or racism, if the near total absence of these terms and their conceptual appurtenances from otherwise wide-ranging collections of essays on the topic is any indication. One can confront the classics but have very little to say about race or racism. Moreover, not only are there no standalone entries for either topic, and arguably the most labor-intensive project on the intellectual histories and genealogies of the field to have been published in the past decade, the classical tradition, race is mentioned in exactly 3 entries, only one of which on fascism engages with the deployment of race as a technology of structural violence, and racism is mentioned the grand total of 3 times in the volume's 1,067 pages. With Frantz Fanon as one of its major inspirations and interlocutors, a now robust literature on the philosophical properties of race thinking has taken off during the last few decades. This literature is almost never consulted by classicists, even by scholars who work in classical reception studies and who wear their theoretical fluency proudly. One hopes that the recent edition of Eos Reads for Black Lives will motivate classicists to do better. While several contributions to a recently published volume on classics and extremists do think with race, race and race theory are so marginal in the field is not to receive any conceptual traction whatsoever in another recently published volume whose major theme is the conceptualization of marginality and canonicity in classical studies. None of the contributions to a highly innovative and again recently published joint venture into the geological properties of classics attends to the sedimentation of race in the bedrock of the discipline. Is it that race and race theory are not viewed as somehow capable of rigorous discourse? Is it that race theory is presumed to be able to speak to and on behalf of persons of color only? If one of the core dialectical features of whiteness is particularizing brown modes of being in order to generalize itself, its kin is the troping of scholarship that characterizes the embodied knowledges of Black and brown communities as deficient in rigor. The product of both implicit and explicit bias, what Shelley Haley termed some years ago, quote, the tendency among white academicians in all fields to equate greater minority involvement with a diminution of academic excellence, end quote, remains alive and well. Much on my mind in recent months has been a passage from Saidiya Hartman's 2007 book, Lose Your Mother, A Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Route. I too, she writes, live in the time of slavery, by which I mean I'm living in the future created by it. It is the ongoing crisis of citizenship. Questions first posed in 1773 about the disparity between the sublime ideal of freedom and the facts of Blackness are uncannily relevant today. The echoes could be heard in a plea, still waiting for an answer, chalked onto a rooftop in the 9th Ward of New Orleans. Help, the water is rising, please. 6 people are trapped on the roof and 2 of them are waving American flags, hoping against the odds that the stars and stripes might make their plight visible, keep them afloat, and demonstrate unequivocally, we are citizens too. But the anxiety and the doubt fueling the assertion was made plain by the photograph's caption, cast away. To me, these words are an electrifying summons to reimagine the temporalities that we inhabit and to discard that middle passage epistemology whose linear compulsions have been dissected by Michelle Wright in favor of a know-how that privileges, quote, enriching intersections with other bodies, other times, and other histories, end quote. Faithful to that summons, I'll focus in these next final minutes on a few incidents that bring out the power of locating oneself in the times of slavery, proceeding in reverse chronological order. In March 2019, I attended the Langford Conference on New Directions in Rome and Slavery at Florida State University, which was co-organized by my Princeton colleague Brent Shaw and Florida State University's Trevor Loop. For the conference, I presented a version of a talk on epistemicide, a concept that I'd encountered in the writings of Boaventura de Sousa Santos. What drew me above all else to working with this concept was the weight it attached to thinking of historical phenomena in epistemological terms, a matter of obvious relevance not only to my own research in Roman history, but to my study of classical reception and classical scholarship. On spilling out of the car that took several of us out from the conference venue and to our conference dinner, I was bowled over by the realization that the participants at a conference on slavery had been taken for the conference dinner to a plantation. This site where we were taken, the Goodwood Museum and Gardens, did not advertise itself as a former plantation. And the signage all studiously and carefully referenced the site's restoration to its 1920s condition, but I know a plantation when I see one. I mentioned this to the conference organizers, we did a little research, and the suspicion was confirmed. Goodwood Museum and Gardens, which hosted our conference dinner, was previously Goodwood Plantation. Originally a tract that had been included with a land grant bestowed by Act of Congress on the Revolutionary War General, the Marquis de Lafayette, in 1824, the acreage for the plantation was acquired by a certain Hardy Croom in 1834. Alighting on these basic facts did not require an intensive archival slog, since Wikipedia, as it turns out, has an entry on this plantation. The question that set up shop in my mind during the conference dinner was why the plantation pedigree of this venue had escaped the notice of those responsible for coordinating the conference's logistics. The next morning, FSU's Trevor Luke opened the morning session with some comments on the history of the museum and gardens and an apology for organizing the conference dinner there. So on one level, the issue was addressed, and we were talking about it and will continue to talk about it in the days and weeks to come. On another level, though, the oversight was emblematic to me of troubling because recurring strategic absent-mindedness on the part of classicists and ancient historians about the conditions and locations in which they produce scholarship. That the plantation pass of the venue would probably have gone unremarked had it not been for the one conference presenter who himself descended from African enslaved persons was concerning, sure, but what troubled me even more was that the conference did not take up, except incidentally or at a distant remove, the tensions and paradoxes of generating scholarship about slavery within an academic and disciplinary matrix whose existence has historically been and continues to be underwritten by racial slavery and white supremacy. The times of slavery. Another surprise, though, was in store for me that weekend in Tallahassee. And this time it was not in the form of a plantation doing business as a dinner venue, but in the form of an airport terminal doing business as a museum exhibit. The final morning of the conference, I skipped out on a sightseeing trip to catch the first flight back to New Jersey. Hitching a ride with another conference score to Tallahassee's airport, I arrived early to indulge myself in the luxury of killing time while waiting for my connection to Charlotte. Wandering across and around the terminal, I came upon an exhibit set up by Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University, FAMU, Critical Mass, the Black Intellectual Rediscovered. Split between the airport and the Meek-Eaton Black Archives, this exhibit offered a look at the extraordinary achievements of African-American writers, teachers, and artists at the turn of the 20th century. Several classicists feature among them, such as Professor R.S. Lovingood of Walhalla, South Carolina, Reverend John Bowen of New Orleans. I'd previously encountered their names in the Black Classicists exhibit that was organized and curated by Michelle Valerie Ronick and brought to the Center for Hellenic Studies in DC by Howard's Caroline Stark. Now I had an opportunity to linger over these figures in the company of the much wider intellectual and social networks to which they belong and which were brought beautifully to life in the exhibit. But this was an exhibit in an airport terminal in a location where most passersby would not so much as allow themselves the opportunity to linger. And it was curated by faculty and students at an HBCU for whom a cascade of financial pressures unleashed by ever more aggressive cuts in state and federal educational budgets had resulted not just in a run of recent bad news, resignations and terminations of financial administrators being the gloomiest highlights, but in the dramatic constriction of FAMU's ability and the ability of other HBCUs to deliver the kinds of humanistic education that had mattered so much to the intellectuals whose lives and achievements were the subject of this exhibit. Many of them had applied themselves unrelentingly to the task of opening up access to humanistic and liberal arts instruction to Black youth at the turn of the century. But there was still another angle to my negotiation of the exhibit's evocativeness. The conference in which I participated that weekend had not involved any members of the FAMU community, at least members known to me. It had not even brought to my attention the existence of this exhibit, which commemorated scholars who in several cases had brought their embodied knowledge of enslavement and subjection into direct and continuous dialogue with their study of classics and ancient history. Notably and unsurprisingly, these scholars, despite the pioneering efforts of Ronick and Stark and their collaborators, do not figure at all in the histories of classical scholarship that anchor the field's articulation and representation of its ontogeny and genealogy in the United States. Some of these intellectuals had published regularly, others had combined publication with exquisitely conceived and ingeniously executed approaches to pedagogical empowerment and civic responsibility, but their writings form little part of the citational economy of American classics. Classicists of a traditional stripe, drilled repeatedly from bachelor's to the PhD in the fine arts of bowing and scraping before feats of European and white American doxography, have little feel for anything that does not leave a copiously paginated and citationally fetishizable trail. What is to be done about this in the future of the discipline, if there is a future? As valediction, I will offer some notes on a poem to which I was introduced last fall by the Dominican-American poet and translator Gina Espaillat, and that comes wrapped in ghostly garments of various kinds. The poem, Areito por Todos, Ritual Song for Us All, is a miniature masterpiece from the pen of César Sánchez Beras and was chosen by Espaillat for inclusion in the Poetry of America series sponsored by the Library of Congress. It stages an argument not only for the prospect of the subaltern survival in the teeth of settler-colonialism and the slave trades, but for an epistemology of spectral return that we might consider relevant to the work of confronting the haunted features of the master's house that is classics. They tossed me away as Apache from the plains and the wind. They tossed me out as Inca from the bark of silence, but I come back from the shadow of past and future. They tossed me aside as Indian, but I return as Black. They tossed me away as Black from the drumbeat of hope. They denied me the sugar mill used to grind my insides. They denied me in Yoruba, in Bantu, in Caravali, but I return to the scrubland as maroon and white and black. They tossed me away as Jew, as Latin, as Moor. They tossed me away as Hispanic, as Gula, as slaver. They tossed me out of the clouds where I denuded the rain. They tossed me out of the hills where I denuded the earth. But I return as Indian. I return as Black. But I return in Spanish, in Yoruba, and in Taino, trekking across the mountains, trying on a new face. I come wearing the mask of those who have no country. They tossed me away, pero vuelvo, pero vuelvo. On the Library of Congress's website, you can access Espaillat's resonant interpretation of this poem, which she takes as an encomium to the indomitability of the forcibly displaced. Espaillat's translation of me sacaron, as they tossed me away, has a flavor of that Virgilian jactatus through which one strand of ancient Mediterranean epic located a community's birth in the storm-tossed journeys of the forcibly displaced. There is no doubt in my mind that the poem opens itself up to a reading that exults in the powers of the multiracial multitude to check or counteract the violences of empire through so much rising. But without undercutting this interpretation, I'd like to offer a second and somewhat bleaker one. The poem simultaneously centers empire's zest for racial and ethnic interpolation and the fragmentation of those racial and ethnic assignments. The first person voice announces their triumphantly pluripotent return in Spanish, in Yoruba, and in Taino, wearing the mask of those who have no country, end quote. In the quiet and steady resolve of return, the distinct and differentiable identities that emerge and that are policed under the sign of empire no longer matter quite as much. These are tossed away as the first person of vengo and vuelvo moves to the forefront. The first person voice professes to wear the mask of those who have no country, but by the mere fact of doing so, they do not recover or reanimate the lost. The tireless and indomitable are not the actual victims of imperial savagery, but instead the actor who, standing in an atrium stocked with imagenes, selects personae and puts on a performance. For centuries, ancient Greece and Rome have been baked into the hegemonic projections of the North Atlantic. The disproportionate interest in and fixation on ancient Greece and Rome, which regularly benefits white communities at the expense of other communities, continues to sideline the existence of other types of classicism and of other means of demarcating what constitutes a classics. creating a structure that brings awareness to other types of classicism and that empowers members of historically minoritized groups to strive collectively and safely towards their study and praxis is a scholarly and ethical priority for those classicists who want to engage the discipline's evolution in conjunction with Euro-American settler colonialism and the transatlantic slave trades. But this structure's durability will ultimately hinge in large part on a critical reassessment of the racial histories and politics of classics, on the ghosts that swirl around its edges, on disciplinary introspection. That is all the rising that we can canvas for today. Thank you very much. And I will now turn to questions.
Thank you so much, Dan-el. You know, what you've laid out for us is a challenge, and I take it, I'm not a classicist. I work on vernacular literatures, mostly of the early modern period and poetry, but I take that as a challenge to me too. I mean, it's not just for classics, it's for the humanities broadly. And before I get to the questions, let me just address a word to the audience. There are about 150 viewers right now around the world. And my role from here on out for the remaining half hour or so is to represent to Professor Pavilla your questions and engage him in conversation around the issues that matter to you. So please don't hesitate to submit them. We have a number right now, and it will perhaps be more than we can get to, but I'm trying to, I try to put them together into a logical order and stage a conversation here with our speakers. So please don't hesitate to send us some questions along for the remaining time. Dan-el, I wanted to start by asking something that was on my mind from the beginning of the talk, which is, since you know the subtitle of our series is The Humanities in the Next 10 Years, the question really has to do with how you would imagine an anti-racist discipline of classics, say, if we imagined in a kind of idealized way that that the lessons of this talk and of the kind of work that you're collating here in the field and trying to bring together in a kind of critical mass, if the lessons represented by that kind of anti-racist classics were taken to heart, and if the next decade were unlike the preceding decades, but evinced a change in the discipline, what would that decade look like? And what I'm interested in is not so much institutional practices, like how departments would do this or that differently, or how fellowships might be awarded differently, but more like the intellectual projects. Like, what are the intellectual projects in classics that have not been pursued, or that would be, you know, on the agenda of a new dispensation in classical scholarship?
Thank you for that question. I find it challenging to answer the question by separating questions of institutional design and sort of the properties that attend to the institutional configuration of the field, and the kinds of research and prospects for research that might define the field in the next 10 years. So the reason I find it difficult is because I not only see the two sort of tightly interarticulated, I feel that any look in the direction of a future in which a genuinely inclusive and interdisciplinary classics becomes possible requires us to gaze at the recent and more distant past of those institutional practices that have constrained the operation of classics in this world. Or, you know, and this is the other line of argument touched on in the lecture, that contribute to the function of classics as a site for the extraction of psychological wages of whiteness. But to answer your question, you know, on its merits and according to its own terms, I would say that what we would hope for, and what I, for one, would very much want to see, are projects that are, first of all, redistributive and reparative in nature, that would engage in more of the disciplinary scrutiny that I've tried to model in the talk, but that do so with an eye to building up other communities of classicism. And so this is what I got to at the end. What does it mean to allow other communities the space and the places in which to claim their own productions of the classical? What does it mean to create a classics that is much more vitally alert to, say, indigenous histories and literatures than it has been historically, and that it is and that it is now? There is also, in addition to this, another aspect of the work of preparing for the future. And this is one to which one of the questions in the Q&A has already gestured. We need to really rethink how we value pedagogy. I mean, this has really been impressed on me in our transition and all of our transitions to the world of Zoom. I've spent a great deal of time trying to think about which practices from those teachers I most admired in classics and other disciplines could carry over to the virtual spaces that define this work right now. And it has occurred to me time and again, as it has occurred to many folks, including those on this webinar, that we do not elevate teaching to the degree that it should be elevated, especially when we talk about institutional design. So here, I go back to my difficulty with parsing your question. But I would also say that part of the responsibility of valuing teaching is in moving beyond an account of the discipline that privileges research in isolation from other practices of the communication of knowledge, right? And so that brings me to the final part of the answer. When we talk about what the future holds for fields like classics and other humanistic disciplines as well, I would say that the future, if it is to be a viable and sustainable one, will need to prioritize a much more diversified ecology of research practices in which the coexistence of research, teaching, public-facing engagement, all are staples of what we do, whether we locate ourselves by reference to a position within the academy or whether we operate in other spaces.
And collaboration, I would imagine, would have a different place than it currently does, as kind of, at both the institutional level, tenure practices, hiring practices, but also just in authorship and the way that projects are conceived. Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you for that. That's interesting. I want to come back to something you devoted a certain segment of the talk to in the first part about citational practices. What would you say to, we have a number of people in the audience who are, let's say, graduate students and undergraduates and even high school students. And for students at those various levels who are just learning citational practice in the first place, that just trying to gain a kind of foothold in a procedure that to many of them can seem quite opaque and very much like a kind of initiation rite for a kind of professional priesthood in which just to know what to cite and to know how to cite it can seem daunting to a lot of people before even during the level of PhD study. So for people like at different levels like that, but pre-professional, that is people who don't yet have a PhD and maybe are well before that stage, how would you encourage them to inculcate a kind of inclusive citational practice right from the inception of it for them? That is not so much about teaching fully formed scholars how to adjust their existing citational practices, but for the future. How would one go about cultivating an inclusive citational practice? And just for the benefit of maybe the non-professionals listening, why does that matter so much?
There was an excellent thread on this on Twitter. I can't remember who initiated the thread, but I know that the classicist Rebecca Futo Kennedy at Denison and others were involved. It was concerned with why, how we teach citation. And here, I think the most important preliminary to commit to, if you are, say, someone who's working with students who are coming to grips for the first time with citation, is to engage them in conversations about why you cite, what it is that you do when you cite, and why it is that you do it. What are the ethical considerations that motivate the practice of citation? And here I have to say that my instruction in these discussions came from well outside classics, because I was not plugged into meaningful conversations about citational ethics until really the early stages of my graduate training. I went to an undergraduate institution, which is now my employer, that has, like many institutions in the Euro-Americas, some articulation of an honor code. And that honor code is supposed to be binding on students and involves, in the case of my employer, self-reporting and self-monitoring on the part of students. But that honor code and the ideological apparatus and disciplinary apparatus attached to it are stand-ins for a more robust conversation about citation. Why is it that we look at plagiarism in particular ways? But we can't have a conversation about citational ethics that lingers only on plagiarism and its consequences. We need to have much more ecumenical appraisal of why it is that we do the work of citation. And here I would urge, students thinking in practical terms about what this means to consider several possibilities. The first is to regularly take up the syllabi that they receive for classes and read them as carefully as possible with specific attention to the identities of the authors who are on that syllabus. Do a little research. In some cases, these identities can be established by some quick Googling, and other times not. But the important point is for folks to take a look at who's on the list of readings. And to just ask some simple questions, first of the syllabus itself, but then ideally of their instructors. Why are we reading this? Why are we reading these people? Are there other people whom we could be reading? If so, why are we not reading them? What kinds of conversations are being had by the text on our syllabus that depend for their full exposition on an understanding of who might have been studying with whom? Whether these people go to school, in the case of secondary scholarship that mobilizes, people who are still living or people who have lived in the not too distant past. To ask questions about the sociology of the professional networks that are embedded in syllabi is to go a long way towards a more richly conceived citational ethics. This has to be modeled. It really does require instructors at all levels to have conversations with their students about why it is that their syllabi are designed in particular ways and what it is that these syllabi exclude. Because every syllabus makes a set of decisions. These decisions are almost invariably exclusionary. So you have to be in the position as an instructor of being prepared to give an account for this. And in that way, to prepare your students to ask questions about the kinds of knowledge that they are going to be cultivating for themselves in your class and in other classes. One of the components of that knowledge is an awareness of whom to cite, when to cite them, and why to cite them. All questions that proceed from the kinds of exposition of method that a teacher can provide simply by laying bare the presuppositions that animate a syllabus.
Okay, thank you. I think we're going to come back to pedagogy in a few moments because we have several questions that touch on different levels of pedagogy from high school up through graduate school. I'm going to try to get to those questions. I want to follow up though with a question about something that maybe is one more question that is in part addressed to the non-professionals in the audience, which is, classics is many things. It is a multidisciplinary discipline in a sense, and it includes history, it includes literary study, archaeology, and so on. Can you, in terms of the concerns of the talk, can you disentangle those subfields a bit for us in terms of their complicity in the issues you're talking about or their prospects for change? Can we differentiate among them? Are there sort of different value systems at work in some of the subfields? Because obviously and in some part, the classical historians go off for part of their week and go talk to other historians, and the archaeologists go to the anthropology or archaeology department and, come together as classicists every now and then. How do we, for the purposes of the issues you're raising, can you disentangle those subfields for us a bit?
You're really inviting me to inhabit my ancient historian self and
I am, yes.
cast some aspersions at the other subfields of classics. No, one approach to take, which is not all that far removed from the framework of the talk, would be to say that classics is defined by this unholy alliance of multiple disciplines that in reality don't or shouldn't be folded under the same rubric. And I have colleagues who are more insistent about this than I am. I have had colleagues over the years say that ancient history should not be in a classics department. It should be with the historians, or the archaeologists should do their own thing, or that the lit people are really up to something that is not compatible with the kinds of questions that archaeologists and ancient historians are intent on debating, and that it may be better for the lit people to think about their own alliances with other fields, separate from those that are devoted to material culture or to change over time, to apply that label to the craft of the historian. I don't know where I stand on this. I mean, I'll say that at a minimum, what I think needs clawing back is the term classics. I mean, I would be glad if classics departments rechristen themselves departments of ancient Mediterranean studies, and really embrace that. But what would be lost there possibly, although I'm not sure how big of a loss it would be a repeat encounter with what the term classics carries and trails behind it. The idea that there is a disciplinary formation that is indexed to value. The classical as valuable is something that is hardwired into the self-understanding of the discipline itself. That notion, though, is peculiarly and uniquely complicit in many of the problems that I diagnosed in the talk, right? So if there is a justification for ditching the name of classics, it is that the name of classics enshrines and lifts up a mode of thinking that I would want people practicing in the field to run away from as quickly as possible, whether they are lit people or art historians or philosophers or ancient historians or archaeologists of various stripes. Do I think that some subfields of classics have had more honest confrontations with the demands of this work than others? Yes, and partly for the reasons I mentioned in the talk. I think that those subfields that lean more in the direction of material culture and sort of comparative approaches to history have had to engage in versions of these conversations. I think archaeology holds some very potent tools in its hands, partly because there have been archaeologists who have been giving a lot of thought to decolonizing archaeology, and have done so in ways that range several steps ahead of what some classicists in more lit focused fields have done. But that's all to say that even if some subfields are making more progress on this than others, the problem that concerns me is not one that is reducible to a kind of teleology of progress. And this is why I had mobilized Michelle Wright's concept of a middle passage epistemology. It is possible to think of making some productive moves towards a future that has a more emancipatory or more equitable classics without adopting a straightforwardly progressivist account that would hold that, ineluctably, we're sort of all moving in this direction one way or another, even for the laggards in the field. And I wouldn't want to describe the field as consisting of people who are hip to the challenges of moving forward productively, and people, on the other hand, who are resistant to this, although there are plenty of people who are resistant to it. I think that there's a responsibility on all of the subfields and on all of the practitioners in these subfields to take stock of what it is that they can do in their work that will advance the objectives of racial equity. And to that end, the work that has to be done will of necessity be somewhat asymmetric in labor. But if there is a future, as I was saying, we'll get to that objective somehow. See, I've evaded your question entirely. I refuse to be pinned down.
No. You threw off a lot of interesting things along the way. I'm watching the clock, so I want to get to the pedagogy things now, because there's a whole subset here of very lively questions touching on pedagogical implications of what you're talking about. So let me start with this one. What advice can you give to a high school Latin teacher to include more facets of classical history and literature to broaden the student's experience of the ancient world and the diversity therein? Topics, texts, sources, interdisciplinary studies.
My advice would be first to look for intercultural points of contact in ancient Western Eurasia that do not simply reassert a particular instantiation of Latin teaching or of Roman culture teaching, for that matter, as based primarily in Italy or the Western Mediterranean. Look for materials that are adaptable for classroom use that speak to Latin and its many afterlives in Roman North Africa, in the Near East. Look for materials that accentuate the cultural interconnectedness of the Roman world and that look to the many nodes for intercultural exchange that exist not just in the bounded space of that Roman world, but in places such as the Indian Ocean, for example. At the same time, though, I want to sound a note of caution here. It is, I think, also the responsibility of teachers, even as they show that the ancient Roman world had what we might call diversity, to foreground and center for their students the ways in which that diversity has been whitewashed in more recent accounts. So what I would encourage some high school teachers to do is to get students to critiquing their own textbooks. Why is it that the Cambridge Latin series frames these stories and episodes the ways that it does? Why is it that this textbook's illustrations look like this? What kinds of proprioceptive qualities of classicism are embedded in these textbooks? Why is the statuary that usually provides visual supplementation to these textbooks and that will figure prominently in any museum trip that these teachers make often a whitewashed statuary? Here there is, of course, a great deal of activity shepherded by classicists and medievalists in recent years around the question of how to think through the whiteness of ancient statuary in its contemporary reception, when we know that ancient statuary was characterized by many, many colors. So these are just some sites. The final recommendation I would make is to get students to think about how questions about the reception of ancient Greece and Rome continue to elicit very powerful feelings in our contemporary moment. But this advice is delivered with a fair amount of hesitation, not because I don't think it's important for students to contend with these questions, but because the teacher may have to contend with some administrators who might not want this kind of teaching to be done. But that's all to say that there are a couple of entry points for getting students to think about the interrelatedness of the cultural representations of the ancient world with the politics of denying and effacing that cultural variety in the contemporary moment. And that, I think, is the best thing a high school teacher could do for their students.
And then as we move up the levels, say from K-12 through to undergraduate and then to graduate education, here's another question. How much well, let me paraphrase. What do you think should be our engagement with historiography and the history of the discipline as undergraduate level instructors and researchers? The questioner says, I'm Brazilian and was trained in Brazil before coming to the US for my PhD. One thing that astounded me with respect to the teaching of the humanities in the US, anecdotally, so this could be wrong or not general, was the lack of disciplinary discussion at the undergraduate level. This was not the case in Brazil, not for me at least, but it is the case in many countries and disciplines, including some institutions and departments in Brazil. Should we try to include more courses that aim to historicize our fields as a way of introducing undergraduates to their fields of inquiry, which could also do some of the labor you're now doing with this research?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this would be fantastic to include more courses that do the work of historicizing humanistic fields. I also agree with the questioner that there are some significant differences between how this is done in US undergraduate departments and in other parts of the world. I would say that especially parts of the world where there has been a more vibrant engagement with questions of decolonization and post-colonialism, you see departments that are interested in designing and scaffolding for undergraduates critical accounts of the histories of particular disciplines. So this is something that absolutely should be taken up in the United States. The question here that I think would be sort of well worth our time to sort of ponder, not just in the context of this talk, but at other sites for disciplinary introspection, is how such courses can work to sort of bring folks into the field of the humanities. So one of the things I've heard from some colleagues, either directly or indirectly, is that the kind of scholarship that some of my partners in this work and I practice is off-putting to undergraduates, that in sort of adopting this critical stance towards the histories of classics and its contemporary practices, one runs the risks of sending undergraduates away, undergraduates who will take one look at these criticisms and say, well, this is not for me. I want to do something else that is not as cleanly indexed to the kinds of structures of oppression that may be of concern to me. Or for that matter, there are also those undergrads who want the humanities to be an aesthetically pellucid and consummately realized site of beauty, and for whom this kind of work may seem as an introjection of a world that does not that is not appealing to them because it is a world from which they want to escape. I am sympathetic to escapist urges, but I recognize as part of the work that all of us in the humanities have to do, the obligation to sell students on how exciting it can be to build disciplines back up. This is an opportunity to remake disciplines. And what I would extend to undergrads in the form of courses that are designed along these lines is an invitation to reimagine what the futures of these fields look like and what it might mean to create disciplines that are maximally attuned to the times that define us, the times of Hartman. So that's really what I think is so rewarding and exhilarating about Leo's question in the Q&A. It would be amazing for more undergraduate programs to do this.
Here's a more sort of professional level question. I really appreciated the connection you draw between Sands on the one hand and Black classicists like John Wesley Gilbert on the other hand. As I understand it, the link you're drawing is primarily one of who gets included in the pantheon of classicists. I'd be interested in hearing more of your thoughts on links at the level of disciplinary practices and epistemology. As you pointed out, Sands includes many anecdotes of classical scholars which are intended to model reading practices, effectively setting the basis for ethical epistemological strictures for all classicists to emulate. How does this work of disciplining by shaping the formation of the scholarly self intersect with the exclusion of Black classicists from disciplinary histories?
This is a great question, and precisely the kinds of questions, precisely the kind of question that I would want a disciplinary reappraisal of the work of Sands and others to generate. My short answer here, because I do have to give one strand of this question further thought, is that what Sands successfully accomplishes in privileging these kinds of anecdotes is modeling a species of intellectual exemplarity that is deracialized, but that is actually on closer examination as deeply implicated in the white identitarian epistemics of classics as anything else you could imagine. What is accomplished in the evasion that characterizes many of these anecdotes, which are chosen quite carefully, is an unwillingness to give credence to or afford legibility to the entanglements of these individual figures who do make it into the pantheon of Sanz's work with the worlds that are defining them, that are in many cases like actively furnishing them with resources taken from the backs of communities that are exploited, resources that are then leveraged into the institutional architectures of the discipline. If we were to move in the direction of a new disciplinary history that centered the activism and teaching and institution building of post-Civil War and early 20th century Black intellectuals, we would be much better positioned as a field to appraise and value the extent of emancipatory work to which these intellectuals committed themselves. So these intellectuals were hard at work in designing institutions of higher learning, social safety and welfare nets in local and state contexts, and sometimes even contributing to the articulation of federal policy. People like Du Bois are involved in projects that are global in their reach. If we were to center the history of classics on these figures, we would be in conversation with folks for whom the global orders of racial subjection were a site for their own constructive and emancipatory projects. And these projects were fundamentally tied to questions of teaching, to questions of organizing, to questions of activist praxis. All of these would, in their very nature, move the conversation away from the representations of the intellectual as put forward in Sands and towards what I think is a much healthier space. And for that reason alone, I think that the question invites a much more exciting disciplinary history to be written.
I think this will be the last question, and it is continuing in the institutional vein, but it's something a little different. Would it be a realistic hope to expand the perspective and curriculum of classics and adjacent cultural fields in leading universities and simultaneously construct similar programs in minority institutions like HBCUs so that they might form their own robust and more eclectic academic presence and influence? Might current circumstances make it more practical to pursue one of these objectives before the other? I guess what we translate this to is, what is the role of HBCUs and similar institutions in a kind of new order that we're imagining here?
Mm-hmm. I mean, this is where, and it's a tough question. This is where the responsibility for reparative and redistributive practice comes to the fore, because as folks who are at HBCUs, at Hispanic serving institutions too, will know the resource limitations are so acute as to really meaningfully imperil the future of anything that looks like a robust humanistic program. So at that point, the question, especially for institutions like my employer or like Stanford, is going to be faced with an ecology of higher learning that has become profoundly inhospitable to the protection, preservation, and funding of humanities programs at HBCUs. What do you do? What is your responsibility? The short answer is that there has to be, as far as I'm concerned, more of a sustainable commitment to long-term partnerships. But these partnerships can't take the form of like the species of extractivism that has been modeled by some collaborations in which basically well-endowed institutions will turn to HBCUs or Hispanic serving institutions with an eye for, the next promising graduate student in a specific field, or the faculty whom they might be able to poach from one institution to another. I think that the question has to be, how do we construct relationships at a time of precarity and scarcity, driven in large part by the decisions of federal and state governments, between institutions that have the financial wherewithal that depends on settler colonialist and racist extractive processes, to weather the coming 10 to 15 years, and those institutions that do not have those financial resources. And this is where the responsibility, not just for classics at specific institutions, but for humanistic enterprises at institutions like Stanford and Princeton, becomes a double one. On the one hand, these institutions have to work hard to make sure that their humanistic commitments remain alive and flourishing for the next 10 to 15 years. So that's a great deal of internal work that has to be done. On the other hand, these institutions also have to do the outward-facing work of identifying and where, and to the maximum extent possible, seeking to buttress those parts of the ecology of humanistic learning in the United States and beyond that have been put in serious harm's way, that are menaced to the point of extinction. And that involves the work of decolonization. It involves thinking very seriously about decolonization, not just as a slogan or metaphor, but as an invitation to redistribute. That also involves thinking about how we train students at all levels to approach this responsibility and to see it through. At the doctoral level, for those institutions that have in place PhD programs, faced with the job crunch that will define the humanities and especially fields like classics in the foreseeable future, one of the obvious tasks, as I see it, is to train students who are prepared to go and take positions at HBCUs, at community colleges, at all of these places where the need for this kind of reparative and redistributive work is so acute. But that also means interrogating the ethics of a system of professionalization that, especially at institutions like Stanford and Princeton, has looked askance at people who have sought to pursue jobs at these institutions. Right. So there's a lot of work to be done there.
A lot of work to be done. Yeah. Dan-el, we are so much in your debt for starting off this series with something that has been, both in the terms of the formal lecture and then in the conversation afterwards, so productive for getting us to think about issues that are go beyond classics. Because in this last episode of our conversation, you're now talking about the agenda for the next 10 years for a humanities center like ours, and we are very mindful of the issues you've raised, and I'm sure we will have an opportunity to come back to them. I hope with you at some point in a future conversation and touch base about these issues again. I hope the audience will join me in thanking Professor Padilla for a really insightful and complicated talk about issues that we are all thinking about in the near future. So thank you, Dan-el. Thank you, audience. And I hope that all of you will be able to join us again next week, Tuesday of next week, November 10th, also at 11 a.m. Pacific, when we have an event in another one of our series, this one called the 1891 Lectures in the Humanities. They are intended to introduce new senior members of the Stanford Humanities faculty to the larger community, but the event is open to everybody on Zoom. And our speaker will be Anna Bigelow, arrived about a year ago at Stanford, newly arrived as an associate professor of Islamic studies in the Department of Religious Studies, and she will give a presentation next week titled Thinking with Islamic Things. Again, everybody is welcome. More information about all our events can be found on our website, shc.stanford.edu. Thank you so much, Dan-el. Thank you, audience, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.